Hi, and welcome to Making Waves on Purpose. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Zeev Klein. Zeev is the CEO and co-founder of Landmark Ventures. I worked with Zeev for many years when I was at PwC, and he supported a number of our efforts. He and his team are really quite amazing. Zeev and Landmark are consummate experience creators. They run 4 different conference series, and their Social Innovation Summit is one of the must-attend events. Interestingly, Zeev and his team are also corporate advisors and investment bankers. So quite an eclectic mix of skills and interests. And Zeev is not only one of the best network people I know, but also one of the nicest, and particularly germane for this podcast, one of the most articulate thinkers in the space. He and I, a number of years ago, had a discussion, and he said that he thought corporate responsibility, ESG, DEI was going towards red companies, blue companies. And here we are. So great discussion with Zeev. Really excited about this one and think you will enjoy it. Without any further ado, Zeev Klein. Zeev, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me on.
You and I spoke years ago, and if I remember correctly, you were prescient and said this ESG, corporate responsibility, sustainability work could lead to red companies, blue companies, or some division thereof. Tell us what you make of this confluence of the culture wars and ESG that we see breaking out.
Yep, thanks for that question. I think, going back probably an election cycle ago, I believe we saw really this politicization of values. We suddenly saw things that voters cared about kind of reach front and center of our TVs. And the inevitable conclusion that we had talked about then was brands are going to seize on this and recognize that, voters vote based on their values and consumers buy based on their values. And brands that are able to espouse values will more likely than not be able to attract a certain type of a consumer. So I think we're, in an early beginning, but I think a trend that is absolutely going to continue. We are going to see stronger and stronger alignment with what we might consider, conservative, i.e. maybe red, indicating Republican values, and then progressive, i.e. blue company values. And we're going to see that play out in the supermarket, in the grocery store, and on Wall Street. I think that's, a lot we can talk about, but I think that trend is certainly underway and the genie's out of the bottle.
I think it's really interesting. For a long time, I think the corporate responsibility space probably skews pretty blue, pretty Democrat. And I've always said hey, we can't champion the Patagonias and not champion the Hobby Lobbies. Because if it's okay for Patagonia to say, why isn't it okay for Hobby Lobby to get their values out front, or Chick-fil-A or others? What are the advantages and disadvantages? How, if you're a company, do you figure out how to walk that tightrope? We see Disney and Bud Light now getting some pushback.
Yeah, for sure. I think at the end of the day, people want to support businesses. They want to support politicians. They want to support causes that represent them, that support them, that look like them, that act like them. And so using Bud Light, which recently came out with what was considered a very progressive advertising campaign, I think the reason there was pushback was that if we imagine a typical Bud Light drinker, they're more likely than not kind of a red state, red profile, conservative, most likely kind of white male Midwestern if we were again profiling. And the question is, does that person, as they reach into their supermarket shelf and they have a choice of products, do they have an emotional connection with the product? Do they have an emotional connection with the values of that product? I would have said up until then, Bud Light probably didn't have a political point of view, didn't necessarily have a progressive or conservative point of view, or if it did, it was kind of lightly out there. And Bud Light took an interesting approach to elevate that and say, we're going to be more forward with our marketing and convey our values more deeply. But I think the pushback was that kind of red profile consumer may not necessarily have that kind of blue profile. And so I'm sure that they did win some market share and recruited new customers. But I think the reason it hit the news was that a lot of their core customers were turned off and went to alternatives. So I feel like that's one of these, great tension points. You can absolutely attract voters, you can absolutely attract consumers, you can absolutely attract followers and attention by sharing your truth and sharing your values. But the louder and more clear you are about what those are, those that have the opposite values are going to be repelled and again will be less likely to vote for you or less likely to buy your product or less likely to support you. And I think that's, the capitalism kind of playing out around market share where, some brands are going to be like, well, I want to be now a redder beer brand because Bud Light created market space that they're moving towards the blue space. But we're going to see this play out, I think, in all categories, including services, which is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's right. I mean, I don't think that companies can totally just sit on the sidelines anymore. I talked to somebody years ago and they said, sitting on the fence only gives you splinters in your ass now. And I think there's some truth to that. But I wonder if businesses can't help bridge the divide in some ways between these, competing values. And if so, are they better off trying to do that or are they better off picking a side and rolling with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. When you blend all the colors of the rainbow, you get a muddy brown. So I don't necessarily believe that a business's job is to play all sides, is to build bridges in every direction. As much as we would potentially like that, I think that that's too tall of a task for a soap manufacturer, right? I do think there's something, or practically, I think there's two strategies. One is kind of an under the radar screen, have your values, support what you're doing, kind of lightly check the box, try not to make too big of a splash and let your product speak for yourself. The other, which I think is actually the right way to do it, is if you feel strongly about something, communicate that, message that, make sure that, your consumers are clear as to when they do business with you, that they're aligned with your values. And even if in the short term, and we'll play out Bud Light momentarily, maybe in the short term, it means that they sell less products in the Midwest states or in the southern states that are traditionally the red states. If they have conviction and are willing to keep going, they'll more likely pick up market share in blue states as this kind of plays out further. And they'll find a new and potentially even a larger customer base. But they need to be clear and consistent about these are our values. And when you engage with our products, when you vote for me, when you consume, again, our soap, our beer, or whatever, that's what you're getting with us, that we have that emotional connection. And ultimately, at a consumer level, I think emotional connections are huge. They're huge across everything that we do. The question, again, is are they willing to go there? Are they clear about the chain of events that's going to happen? And do they have the fortitude to kind of see that through? My gut feel is those that do it exceptionally well are going to be exceptionally successful.
Yeah, it's interesting because it looks like Bud Light is kind of blinking on it a little bit, whereas Disney hasn't blinked. But the stakes are different too, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, depending on how you look at it, Disney stakes are possibly larger. I mean, if we're being very honest, that's to some degree, you could see a scenario where they leave Florida, right? I mean, that's probably the highest stake outcome here. I can't pretend to speak with depth about Disney other than to say I'm proud of them for their conviction. My layman's view is I think that there's political overreach. I think in this country, a politician can't penalize a corporation for having a point of view. That's a little bit different to me than a consumer making a product choice in the aisle. I think you're really seeing, a government overstep. We'll see what the courts and others think. I don't think that Disney's view has hurt them with their consumers, though, which is kind of where I think that they have the fortitude where, on average, their consumers are continuing to support them, depending on how we look at theme parks versus the majority of Walt Disney. But they didn't see the consumer backlash that Bud Light saw. So in that sense, I think that that's what's giving them the green light to kind of continue. And again, relatively speaking, I'm not sure that Disney was a surprise. I think you would view Disney as a little more progressive, a little bit more, their position that they took, I think would align with your view of Disney. I think the Bud Light was more of the surprise, where I think that's where some of their core consumers didn't necessarily see it coming and didn't necessarily support kind of the more progressive view that Bud Light elevated in their marketing and advertising.
Yeah, there's much less surprise. I mean, Disney content is quite amazing these days in terms of its diversity of storytelling and who the characters are and how kids and adults can see themselves in these stories. It's a very consistent narrative in a way that Bud Light was quite a surprise. I think it's fascinating. I think one of the things that we're seeing, though, is this tension in values that is likely more polarized because it's politicized into a two-party system. I think there's more overlap than we give ourselves credit for, and yet can't seem to have a richer conversation. Is there any way, to your point, maybe this isn't the job of companies, but how do you see that playing out in a more constructive way across the U.S.?
I think if we generally believe that competitive landscapes are at some version of an equilibrium, it's conceivable to see an upstart brand look to attack an incumbent by leveraging values, right? So if, a soda example, if you've got Coke and Pepsi, you could imagine a new third party coming in and saying, you know what, I'm going to compete based on values. We're going to be the most liberal or the most conservative soft drink out there. And we think we can peel off a portion of market share through that angle. And if that plays out, eventually it puts Coke and Pepsi in this, example on the defense to say, look, this upstart is coming into our space. They are indeed getting market share. We now need to, react. And I think the reaction again will be on values. Do we want to take a side? Do we align ourselves with one direction or another? I'd say historically corporations have enjoyed the neutrality. But my view is today in a very, social media world, values driven world, politically driven world, I think we do expect and brands are being asked questions, what politicians do you support? What policies do you support? What's your HR view around abortion laws? And a lot of the employees are asking their corporations like, the Supreme Court just decided XYZ. What is our take on that? How does that manifest in terms of what does that mean for me to be an employee here? What does that mean for our consumers to continue buying our products? And I think corporations historically aren't ready to have their values that aggressively kind of scrutinized. We saw some of that during COVID around different policies around, masks or vaccines, entering a store, entering a workforce. And I think it's just the beginning. I think once, I said earlier, that genie's out of the bottle, those questions are going to remain. I think we are right to ask our companies where we work and our companies where we buy from, where do you stand on these topics if I'm going to continue engaging with you? And I think that's one of these, new competitive fronts in the marketplace. It's no longer about price or quality. Values, supply chain values, ethical values, moral, political, I think are now absolutely inside of that competitive landscape.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, this gets to so many sustainability leaders say, I'm working myself out of a job. This is going to become the DNA. I've always thought that was silly because there's always going to be the next issue around the corner that we don't see coming and that we need to prepare ourselves. And really what we're trying to build is not just the ability to adapt to climate or to make our companies more diverse and inclusive, but to actually develop a sense of purpose and a set of values that can guide our business over the long term. How do you see companies developing that muscle memory?
I think it's a great point. First and foremost, best case, it already exists within them, depending on if they're old or new companies, if the founding team is still present and operating. But traditionally, companies are born with, great conviction. And so the question is, how do we tap into that conviction? And again, for companies that have some tenure, how do you evolve that conviction? How do you evolve, your alignment with your community? But I think that's something that, isn't where maybe historically it's been the role of the sustainability or ESG or corporate affairs or citizenship or government affairs. I think today we're seeing that responsibility permeates across the entire organization. HR and marketing and finance and everybody, I think, should and have an equal and active say. I think the only question is maybe aperture and volume of, how big and how wide, how many issues, and kind of how loudly do you want to, espouse your views. A lot of corporations can feel quite strongly, but do so more quietly or privately. And then to an extreme, we'll kind of argue greenwashing is the other side. Perhaps a corporation doesn't even feel that strongly, but they see an opportunity or a movement or, a capitalistic marketplace opening to tackle an issue where maybe they're relatively not so strong, but to gain market share by claiming credit for XYZ. I'm the most sustainable company, and maybe you aren't, but if you can persuade the consumers, you can, pick up a couple extra points, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's absolutely one of the new battlegrounds that, a modern corporation will face. And then add to that, narrative and storytelling, is it enough to have those values, or are you good at communicating them in modern channels like TikTok or Snapchat or Twitter or whatever? Can you outmessage your competitors? And for those that do and have strong values and have, good products, they're the ones that are going to be the market leaders of the future.
I think you're exactly right on greenwashing because you wouldn't greenwash if you didn't see value in doing it. Now, you might not see enough value to actually go and do the work, or the work may be lagging, and that's a separate question. But clearly, to do it, you see some value in it. And I love your point about how this opens up the opportunity for competitors to enter into the market and say, hey, listen, you say you're doing this, you're not, and we are, and differentiate themselves. So that could be a new battleground. I love what you said about companies are born of great conviction. That's an eye-opener for me that I hadn't really thought about in the past, because I've talked to so many companies who are said, like, corporate responsibility was built into our company in 1848. And I'm like, really? I kind of roll my eyes. But it is interesting. The values may have been different, but there was conviction behind why they were started for many companies. I like that.
Yeah. And I do think, oftentimes the values can remain and can be refreshed and can be modernized. But sometimes there's reasons that they need to be upended, right? There's no shortage of examples of corporations that have pivoted, that have evolved, and that have also evolved their social views. And so to some degree, it's maybe latent inside organizations. The question is kind of who has the power and the political power to bring it through. At the end of the day, I do generally believe in the Milton Friedman argument of the business of business is business. And so to some degree, these decisions need to go through the lens of, shareholders and stakeholders. But I think both you and I would agree that these decisions and having values benefit shareholders and stakeholders, not just in the long run, but I think in the short run. I think the corporations that are best in class drive outsized returns for their shareholders. So I don't see a conflict there. Question is, what does leadership appreciate and value? What are the immediate incentives? And are people persuaded that strengthening values and putting that at the forefront will lead towards sustainable growth? And I believe for the majority of companies, yes. And I'd almost ask the other way. If everybody knew your values very loudly, if that would hurt your business, there seems to be some sort of a schism there, right? I'd be very nervous about a business that isn't proud of putting out their values loudly. That's for another day, maybe.
Oh, I love that. What are you working on at the frontier around the corner that you think businesses need to be thinking about?
I appreciate that. We actually just spoken about this. I think the introduction of artificial intelligence is going to be one of the most challenging topics that corporations face. It seemingly doesn't immediately engage with kind of social impact and values, but I think it quickly does, where we'll be faced with choices around how do you retain and upskill your workforce? I think it's going to be a big question. What's your comfort with, machines maybe doing 90% of a job a human used to do? Is that good enough or acceptable? How do you view an evolving consumer and an evolving employee, where we now have machines, artificial intelligence, make a lot of decisions, generate a lot of data, consume the data, parse the data for us? I think there's going to be just some real interesting conflicts where corporations are embedded in their communities and are now making choices that perhaps impact the livelihoods or jobs of people in those communities. And how do they navigate the competitive pressure where if they don't make some of these decisions, if they don't evolve their workforce and their competitors are, they may no longer be in business. And then layer on top of that other ethical, moral, and existential threats perhaps that artificial intelligence brings. I'd say kind of a little bit like maybe the internet revolution. Everyone is going to use the internet. Everyone's going to use artificial intelligence. The question is, how do you do it? And going back to our prior conversation, with which values, and how do you manifest your values as you go through this kind of transformational process, which my suspicion is will occur faster than people realize. I think we're going to look back in 3 to 5 years and be very surprised at how quickly AI became embedded in all facets of our lives, our work, our communities, and certainly our workplaces.
Simultaneously exciting and terrifying.
I'm an optimist, so I have more excitement than terrifying. But yes, I think this is going to be a great leadership challenge for corporations, for us as individuals, and certainly for our political leaders as well.
Fabulous. Well, thanks for sharing your insights with us, Zeev. It was great to connect with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff, for having me.
Pleasure.